Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to this Academy of Political Science forum. These forums showcase recent work published in the journal Political Science Quarterly on major and important topics in public affairs and world affairs. And our topic for today is a very timely and important one. It's the topic of human rights. My name is Bob Shapiro. I'm president of the Academy of Political Science and editor of the journal Political Science Quarterly, and I'm also a professor of political science and international and public affairs at Columbia University. I want to turn over the floor now to our moderator, Professor Marilena Mantis. Marilena Mantis is a professor of political science at Sacred Heart University and is the associate editor and managing editor of Political Science Quarterly. Professor Mantis.
Thank you, Professor Shapiro. On behalf of the Academy of Political Science and its journal, Political Science Quarterly, I welcome you as well to today's forum. The event is one of a series hosted by the Academy of Political Science to spotlight prominent articles published in PSQ. Today, we feature an article that will be published in the spring 2024 issue of our journal, entitled Human Rights Pragmatism, Problems of Structure and Agency. We have with us the author of the article, Jack Snyder. Professor Snyder is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Relations in the Political Science Department and the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. His recent books include Human Rights for Pragmatism, Social Power in Modern Times, and Human Rights Futures. His articles on democratization and war, imperial overstretch, and international relations theory after September 11th have appeared in leading political science journals. Also with us is our discussant, Kenneth Roth. Kenneth Roth is the former executive director of Human Rights Watch, one of the world's leading international human rights organizations, which operates in more than 90 countries. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, he served as a federal prosecutor in New York and for the Iran-Contra investigation in Washington, D.C. He has conducted numerous human rights investigations and missions around the world and has written extensively on the topic. Welcome to both of you. We're happy to have you with us. Our forum will be structured as follows. We will begin with a presentation of the article by Jack Snyder, and that will be followed by comments by Kenneth Roth. We will then move on to a question and answer session. Members of the audience will have the opportunity and are strongly encouraged to submit questions for our panelists. To do so, you could submit questions at any time using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So we could begin. Professor Snyder.
Well, thank you so much to Bob and Marilena for giving us this opportunity. And thanks especially to Ken for engaging with the ideas in the article and the book. The promotion of human rights is usually seen as an idealistic, altruistic mission. It's often seen as an appeal for justice, especially for the most vulnerable people in society. A key tool used to advance human rights towards these goals is the naming and shaming of violators. And it's not only activists and folks at the Human Rights Watch that use such tools, but we often hear a similar tone from Democratic politicians who sometimes call human rights violating leaders of powerful countries pariahs and demand that they be removed from office, even though it's often the case that that's not a practical goal. I want to thank Ken in particular for the opportunity I had to present a couple of the chapters of my book, including the chapter on shaming at Human Rights Watch, where we had lively and fully engaged debates on this, including me talking through the academic research in the field of social psychology on the emotion of shaming and how it often leads to backlash and including the glorification of deviance. So on the geopolitical stage these days, we're seeing the emergence of a problem, namely that this kind of shaming and in general, liberal-based promotion of human rights ideals are meeting effective opposition from illiberal strongmen backed by populist nationalist social movements. They call the human rights approach and liberalism more generally decadent and degenerate, the product of out-of-touch elites whose ideas defy traditional common sense. They say that imperialistic liberals are trying to replace national self-determination with corrupt neoliberal cosmopolitanism that hurts the interests and tramples on the morality of the average person in their society. Now, moralism, legalism, and universalism of, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is valuable as a direction-finding compass for reform. But we and the human rights movement and all friends of human rights should remember at the same time that many of these principles are still aspirational rather than fully achieved objectives in many societies in the world. And in thinking about strategies for turning those aspirations into a reality, it's important not to forget the indispensable role of pragmatic expediency and the self-interest of powerful groups in society, often the majority in societies, not necessarily the disadvantaged minorities, that these self-interests of the powerful have played an important historical role in some of the greatest triumphs of the human rights movement in the past, including the abolition of slavery, Gandhi's independence and social rights movements, and the Martin Luther King era civil rights movement in the United States. These depended in large part on powerful majorities' self-interest in cutting expedient deals to gain power for the advocates of rights. Often being led by reform parties, not only by human rights advocacy organization, pragmatic parties that formed opportunistic coalitions for policy change. Think about Nelson Mandela bargaining with the apartheid regime in South Africa. Think of the Chilean reformers bargaining with General Pinochet so that he could retain his immunity as a senator rather than going straight to jail, allowing them to get him out of office as president. Think even of Eleanor Roosevelt, the mastermind of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, who went out of her way to reassure American segregationists that their practices of separate but equal and what she called murder cases, but what we call lynching, would not be interfered with by the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. This she had to do because the Southern Democrats were part of the Roosevelt coalition. Of course, they welched on these promises to the segregationists, but in the meantime, they acted expediently. So rights-based liberalism is a system that works well. It's attractive because it works better than alternatives as a formula for successful modernity. We forget the fact that there's no country except for small oil states and Singapore that has ever progressed past the level of 1/4 US GDP per capita without becoming a fully fledged liberal democracy with rule of law and the equivalent of human rights for its citizens. This is what is known by the shorthand of the middle income trap. And if you're not a liberal human rights observing state, you get stuck in the middle income trap and don't get to the other side of prosperity. We should also remember that liberal rights observing powers have been on the winning side of 6 out of the last 6 hegemonic wars in the international system, and that no two democracies have ever fought a war against each other. So liberal rights observing societies are not just moral and legal, but they're also effective. They are winners. Now, in countries that don't have a rights-based order or that are trying to keep one in the face of challenge, how can this be done? In the article and in the book that the article is based on, I talk about the value of mobilizing core supporters for the rights movement, but also the need to attract coalition partners based on their self-interest. I talk about building institutions that will function effectively in the incompletely liberal present, which is the reality in so many countries in the world even today, while creating a bridge to the more fully rights-based future. I also talk about the importance of using vernacular normative talk, including religion, which is sometimes a hard vernacular to use for secular human rights professionals, to open a path to a more fully rights-based discourse in the future. So how can these things be accomplished? Some rules of thumb are: avoid dividing your supporters over issues of abstract principle. Lead in your advocacy with popular issues like anti-corruption. Stress inclusive class-based issues such as labor rights over identity issues, which tend to be divisive. I was just looking at the Human Rights Watch website the other day and noticed that there is uptake of labor rights issues in China, for example, but the recent reports that I saw emphasized Uyghur slave labor, an important human rights abuse that certainly deserves attention, but did not address the labor rights of the the broader Chinese working class, which is, dismayed with its situation as the Chinese economy contracts and the treatment of labor is poor. There's the famous social movement in China called lying down flat, workers that are exploited and exhausted and tired of it and ready to just quit. Um, so it's important to signal to the Chinese majority, not just the ethnic minority that so exploited the Uyghurs, that the entire working class in China has a stake in the success of the human rights movement and revolution. Um, Another rule of thumb is to remember to explain clearly how temporary compromises can create the conditions for rights successes in the future. Here, an issue that risks setting back rights progress, it would be having too hard of a hard line in favor of immigration rights at the moment, at a time when immigration is such a neuralgic issue among the publics of the advanced democratic states. And I think there needs to be thought given to the importance of making adjustments in immigration policy so as to not alienate the broad public opinion and undermine democracy. Think about moderating discourse on this in order to prevent setbacks that could have long-run consequences that would harm the human rights project. So in the article, I have a section where I respond to Q&A sessions that I had after I published the book, where a lot of the discussion that I got from the audience was about the structural facilitators or limiters of human rights success and how that relates to the agency of people who care about human rights and want to promote human rights now, immediately. And plenty of people in my audiences would say, well, you're telling us about all the structural barriers to successful rights promotion in many societies in the world today. And how long do you expect us to wait until we can actually do something? And my argument to them and in the article is that it's important to tailor tactics to what's feasible given the structural constraints and opportunities. But that doesn't mean that you have nothing to do until the facilitating conditions arrive. In fact, that makes for a very large and pressing agenda to act in ways that create more conducive conditions as a first step to human rights successes in the longer run. So statistical studies have listed some of the major correlates of success in actually creating a human rights favorable environment. And the number one correlate in these studies is war. War is the greatest enemy of human rights. And therefore, I submit that this suggests that the most important thing to do in order to advance the cause of human rights is to work for peace. And in the debate over peace versus justice, for example, do we ever give an amnesty to perpetrators of human rights violations if that's the only thing that we can do to get to a peace settlement with those perpetrators and to get them to agree to step down from office, for example. So if we follow the empirical research on human rights, peace is a precondition of justice. The second highest correlation with human rights is democracy. Now, you probably are thinking, well, isn't that just a truism? Because democracy runs on human rights. So, of course, there's going to be a correlation between them. And that's certainly true. But there's also an empirical correlation between democracy and the correlates of human rights, which are causes of democracy or facilitators of democracy. And so these include a relatively high GDP per capita in the society, literacy and citizen skills, the institutional capacity for orderly governance, agreement on national boundaries so that we know what is the group of people that is going to exercise self-determination. Having a diverse economy that's not just based on oil, and having a political coalition on the left. So all of these facilitating conditions are things that human rights advocates and friends of human rights, no matter what their job description is, have on their to-do list. So to conclude, I want to talk about the strengths of liberal societies in the second half of the 20th century. Where these societies were good at devising pragmatic systems for reconciling tensions between freedom and equality, and between uncensored debate and, on the other hand, reliable vetting of information important to the public interests. These were essentially liberal welfare states that had effective regulation of invisible hand systems of the market for goods and for the marketplace of ideas. This system of the liberal welfare state has been dealt blows by political polarization and technological change. And one of the most important issues on the agenda for human rights advocates is to find a way to adapt and reinvigorate the idea of a socially embedded liberalism. And this goal, which is not only a moralistic and legalistic principle, but a pragmatic project that needs to be urgently undertaken, links my argument with the philosophical pragmatists and U.S. reformers of the early 20th century. And pragmatism is in the title of my book and my article in this sense. So thanks very much for giving me a chance to put out my ideas today.
Thank you, Professor Snyder. Thank you very much for those remarks. Just a reminder to all our members of the audience to feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to enter questions directly to the panelists. So we move on now to the discussion part of our presentation, and we have with us Kenneth Ross. Please feel free to begin your comments.
Okay, thanks, Marilena. And thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate this opportunity. I think Jack presents, a very important and challenging set of arguments. And frankly, I appreciate his willingness to engage with the Human Rights Watch staff, to invite me, since, he knows that we often disagree on a lot of these things. It's hard to do this rich book justice, but what I thought I would do is to try to, raise a few critiques and a few embellishments, which I hope will enhance the subsequent conversation. Now, Jack presents the human rights movement as an idealistic endeavor, less pragmatic than concerned with these ideals. And, while there's obviously an element of truth to that, it is a bit of a caricature. And I wanted to, start by just outlining some ways in which this effort to sort of reduce naming and shaming, which many who deride the human rights movement kind of harp on, to reduce that to just sort of a statement of idealistic principles, is not really what we do. So just to begin with, Jack referred to, for example, Biden referring to the Saudi government as a pariah. Now, that's Biden, but that's not what the human rights movement tends to do. Shaming does not involve name calling. It's not about throwing around epithets. It's about presenting facts that we investigate and expose to demonstrate a government's misconduct. And this is shameful, not because your typical dictatorship has any remorse or feels any guilt, but rather because every government is looking for its reputation. It's concerned about its legitimacy. And when we are able to show a discrepancy between its purported, adherence to human rights ideals and the ugly reality, that's shameful. That's delegitimizing. Governments hate it. And so they tend to fight back. Now, the reason this is so powerful is that, these rights are not just things written down in treaties. These rights are things that people want. I've traveled the world during my career, and I've never met somebody who wants to be summarily executed, or somebody who wants to be tortured, or somebody who wants to be deprived of healthcare or housing or an education. These are basic desires that everybody has. They're an essence of being human. And so, when we show a government falling short, that is shameful. And we see the breadth of the desire for accountable governments in these, periodic outbreaks of mass public movements against autocracy in favor of democracy, which is seen in country after country in recent years. Now, there are a few exceptions to this, which I'll get to, around the rights of women, sex-oriented rights, rights of religion. But for the most part, these rights are, uncontested and broadly desired by the people of the world. Now, the reason I talk about, naming and shaming being a bit of a caricature is that, in addition to the fact that we don't just call people names, we expose their misdeeds, but also we hardly ever just stop with that. The human rights movement, uses the record that we document, the account of the misconduct, to then try to generate pressure on governments. And that's why, Human Rights Watch and comparable organizations have large advocacy staffs based in key capitals around the world, in addition to our research staff based in abusive countries around the world. And that is because we take this information and we then try to enlist influential governments on our behalf to try to withhold something that the target government wants until they improve. And there's always something new. It could be an arms sale, it could be military aid, it could be an invitation to a fancy summit. There's always something. And by finding that and conditioning it, we can generate pressure on the government to behave better. Now, I guess it's in the article, Jack says, well, why are we focused on things like, calling what's happening to the Uyghurs genocide, rather than focusing something more pragmatic, like barring the product of forced labor? But that's exactly what Human Rights Watch did. We were actually instrumental in getting the US government to adopt the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which presumptively bars all imports from Xinjiang unless it can be proven, which nobody can, that it was not the product of forced labor. We spend very little time on whether what's happening against the Uyghurs is genocide or not. Indeed, that's often contested. And so, partly because of the caricature, people have been decrying the end of shaming, the failure of the human rights movement for as long as I've been doing this. I mean, I remember the writer David Reef in 1999 had a big article in the New York Times Magazine. He says the human rights movement is in trouble. Naming and shaming is over with. But in fact, the ability to expose governmental misconduct, the ability to generate pressure on governments to change the cost-benefit analysis of repression, this works to this day. And maybe the best test of its power is by looking at how governments respond, because leaders really hate it. When we were able to get the UN Human Rights Council to create a formal body known as the Group of Eminent Experts to scrutinize the conduct of that Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, where it was repeatedly killing civilians, the Saudis behaved better. When during the pandemic, when the council was meeting only virtually, and the Saudi government was able to use a combination of threats and bribes to get that scrutiny lifted, the number of civilian casualties in Yemen immediately doubled. So it made a difference, the scrutiny in the behavior of the Saudi government. Xi Jinping, if he didn't care, why would he have personally called 4 heads of state to try to fend off UN Human Rights Council debate of the Chinese government's persecution of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? Even when a leader is beyond shaming, somebody like, Syria's Assad, who's committed, every crime in the book, so he really has no reputation left, there often are ways to find avenues that he does care about. In that case, we focused on Putin, who, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, did care about his reputation. And we were able to go to Macron, to Merkel, and to the Turkish government and get them to pressure Putin to the point that the bombing of civilians in Idlib, the main rebel-held area in northwestern Syria, stopped in March 2020 and stopped for 3 years because of this pressure that was put on Putin. So, there are ways to find effective pressure that is not about just spouting ideals. It's about being very pragmatic. And that's kind of the bread and butter of what the human rights movement does. Now, there is, Jack talks about, well, shouldn't we be more focused on deal making, on expediency, on pragmatism? And I should say that, the human rights movement does try to be principled in terms of what we describe as a human rights violation. I mean, that's one way that we're different from just an ordinary political group. But once we decide that it is a rights abuse, as I mentioned, we're very pragmatic about how we generate pressure to change that. And, reading Jack's article, it made me think back to the British academic Stephen Hopgood, whose book, The End Times of Human Rights, bemoans the loss of the moral purity of the old amnesty activists sitting around the kitchen table writing letters to free dissidents, and it blames Human Rights Watch for sullying the movement by engaging in politics. And here Jack takes the opposite view. He says, we're not engaged in politics enough. We're too much like the old amnesty activists. Now, I think actually Hopgood had it wrong. I mean, I think we need to be more pragmatic. We're more powerful when we are. I think Jack has it wrong in not recognizing the pragmatism that is very much at the heart of what Human Rights Watch and others today do. Now, Jack said, oh, well, we would, we're so, taking the case of the Uyghurs, he says, why are we only focusing on Uyghur forced labor? Why don't we look at, Han Chinese forced labor as well? And, the reason is because in the case of China, we don't have access to the domestic audience. We do have access to international actors whom Beijing cares about. And they were not going to cut off all trade with China. That was not in the cards. But to cut off trade that was the product of Uyghur forced labor was in the cards. We got that from the US government. We're getting sort of variations of that theme from the European Union. And it illustrates that, we have to kind of make these basic political judgments to get what we can to maximize the pressure that we can put on an abusive government. Now, Jack talks about sort of the war-peace dichotomy and the fact that, we're too focused on insisting on justice and we don't look at the importance of stopping war. In fact, that's not really what we do. If you look at the Colombia Peace Accord, where President Santos won the Nobel Peace Prize, we objected to the initial proposal that was an effective amnesty for serious abusers in the FARC or in the military who had been responsible for the so-called false positive executions. But we agreed and upheld the ultimate agreement, which was to have real trials and to have so-called restrictions on liberty that we understood were short of prison. That was the best we could do, and we took it. I was in Sudan before the civil war broke out most recently and met with Burhan, the top general, and pushed him to cooperate with the International Criminal Court, which he agreed to do and did. I did not push him to surrender Bashir, which I knew wasn't in the cards. So, these are the kinds of things you get what you can. You push things forward incrementally. Now, Sam Moyne at Yale pushes a variation of this theme saying, why doesn't the human rights movement just try to stop war? Why are we focused on upholding humanitarian law, which discredifies or, makes war more palatable? But in fact, there's a division of labor for very pragmatic reasons. And you can have groups like the International Crisis Group that tries to settle conflict and groups like Human Rights Watch that tries to mitigate violations of the Geneva Conventions. And I think that that approach makes sense. The idea that justice impedes war just doesn't fit with the historical record. If you look at, for example, why did we have the Dayton Peace Accord? It's because the Bosnian Serb military and political leaders, Mladic and Karadzic, had been charged by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So they didn't go to Dayton for fear of arrest. And Milosevic was able to go and agreed on a peace deal without an amnesty. I think Holbrooke agrees we wouldn't have had a Dayton Accord had Mladic and Karadzic shown up. Similarly, the charges against former Liberian President Charles Taylor had him leave office, very quickly. And that was the prerequisite to a democracy emerging in Liberia, which exists to this day. When the Lord's Resistance Army was charged, they basically disappeared as this awful rebel force that kidnapped child soldiers. So there are plenty of examples where justice actually enhances war. And you've got to look at it pragmatically and get as much as you can in these circumstances. When we were talking with German Chancellor Merkel about the European Union-China investment deal, she just wanted the deal to go forward. We didn't push for no deal. We pushed for a deal that was conditioned on not profiting from weaker forced labor. And in the end, that was sufficient to block it, really because of the intervention of the European Parliament. When we were involved in negotiating the Child Soldiers Treaty, the initial goal was to get a straight 18 bar, that you wouldn't be able to deploy anybody who was below 18, you wouldn't be able to induct or draft anybody who was under 18, and you wouldn't be able to voluntarily recruit anybody who was under 18. The Pentagon said, we want to voluntarily recruit kids out of high school when they're still 17. We'll agree to the other part if you let us do this for 17-year-olds. We agreed. That's what the treaty says today. So you make these compromises all the time. And I think it's just unfair to the human rights movement to pretend that we are sort of, dogmatic and unprincipled and unconcerned, or, dogmatic and unconcerned with pragmatism. Now, with respect to prescription, Jack, focuses on strengthening democracy. And I take him not to mean it in the tautological sense that, of course, democracies are better respect for rights, because part of the definition of a democracy is not just electoral majoritarianism, but that with the rule of law and respect for rights. Jack, critiques the rush to democracy in certain countries, and I agree with him with respect to Iraq. I don't think it's a fair characterization of either Burundi or Rwanda, where the problem is just a dictatorship. It's not a rush to democracy. But he tries to refine it by saying we need to focus on, building the broad conditions, the broad coalitions that would support democracy. We agree with that. I think Jack puts more of an emphasis on technical assistance, which I usually find to be a waste of time. Dictatorships don't need to be taught how to respect human rights. They need to be pressured to respect human rights. Xi Jinping would love technical assistance. You can just imagine how this conversation would go. Yes, we reserved a conference room for you in the third sub-basement of the foreign ministry. Obviously, we'll have no publicity, but these conversations can go on until you criticize us. And once you criticize us, we're going to cut off the dialogue, which the Europeans don't want in particular, because they want to pretend that they're doing something. So, this is technical assistance doesn't work with a government that is intent on repression because it's decided that, repression is in its interest, and the only way to change it is to change the cost-benefit analysis of repression. Now, Jack says we should be, building a middle-class coalition to uphold rights. And he's right to point to the middle-income trap, and that, that's an argument one can make. But it's not really sufficient. I mean, it reminded me a bit of the old most favored nation argument that we heard for why, Bill Clinton stopped conditioning most favored nation status for China on its respect for human rights, because he said trade is a human rights policy. It'll create a middle class that will insist on its rights. And we've now seen that that's, completely not enough. There's been a huge growth in the middle class in China, in Russia, in India, at the same time as there's been a degradation in respect for human rights. The governments have sort of taken the economic benefits of middle class status and just enhanced their repressive capacity. So it's not enough to just have a middle class. You do have to combine that with pressure to uphold human rights. Plus waiting for democracy is a long time sometimes, and you can get a lot done before you have a democracy. I think about, Saudi women's rights activists or Egyptian human rights activists who we've gotten released. I think of, the pressure on Rwanda to stop supporting the murderous M23 in Eastern Congo, or the pressure on Israel to stop, bombing and starving civilians in Gaza. I think about our work in Libya under Gaddafi to get political prisoners free when there was no democracy in sight. This is possible to do, with external pressure when the dictator wants something from the international community. Now, Jack says that we shy away from building a movement because it's too unruly. And that's an argument that we're getting, sort of this focus on movement building. It's kind of become the flavor of the month. I mean, Mark Malloch Brown at Open Society Foundations is pushing this, and many of the foundations are. The problem is not that movements are unruly. It's that it's hugely time consuming to build a movement. Human rights groups are tiny. David Riefen, who I mentioned, was urging us back in 1999 to stop, the elite advocacy in Washington and go spend time in shopping centers to build a movement. If we had done that, it would have been a drop in the bucket and we would have made no difference whatsoever. It's the tiny resources available to the human rights movement are not conducive to movement building. Plus, movements are incredibly hard to sustain even when they do emerge on their own. Where is Black Lives Matter today? What happened to Occupy Wall Street? People need to go back to their day-to-day lives. They can't keep being activists all the time. And then the question is, well, what do you do next? And this is when you do need, kind of professional organizations like human rights groups. Plus, movements really only get built for certain big, long-lasting issues, police abuse or inequality. But the vast majority of the issues that the human rights movement addresses will never give rise to a mass movement. You need, these tools of exposure, of shaming, of pressure, if you're ever going to address these issues at all. Movements only hit a handful of issues. Now, Jack says it's better to, enable people to defend their own rights. Of course it is. But, what do we do until then? We'll be waiting a really long time if we're going to wait for the Uyghurs to promote their rights. And certainly the Uyghurs in exile, they're very happy for Human Rights Watch to be involved. You could say the same about Egyptian or Saudi activists or wherever. So there's, a lot of work that can be done long before we have anything like a democracy. Now, final point I will address is just kind of the issue that Jack brings up of how do you fight autocrats? And, some of his points I think are quite valid. We should use the vernacular. We should avoid legalisms. I think Human Rights Watch does that. Most of our reports don't even bother with human rights standards. It's just kind of assumed. We focus on the facts. We should avoid the identitarianism of the more doctrinaire left, which is completely divisive. It works against trying to build, a critical mass, especially in the movable middle. Jacques says we should focus on corruption and similar bread and butter issues. I totally agree, and we do it all the time. If you look, for example, at my 2022 World Report essay, that was one of the major themes, that autocrats are self-serving, they tend to be corrupt, that democracies, are more accountable and less inclined in that direction. And so, Human Rights Watch has looked at, how Viktor Orban in Hungary is, paying off his cronies by using European Union money to build football stadiums, while leaving hospitals completely neglected. We focused on how President Sisi in Egypt is pursuing these huge vanity projects like a new capital while people are immersed in poverty. We focused on how Obiang in Equatorial Guinea is living lavishly while the people are utterly impoverished. We focused on how Erdogan in Turkey was giving out these building code amnesties, which proved to be so disastrous when the earthquake took place. So, we try to stress over and over that accountability, transparency, that's the antidote to corruption. And those are very strong arguments for rights. So here, I think Jack and I are on the same page. I think maybe disagree with what the human rights movement does, because it's not just that we support protesters. We actually join in the fight against corruption. But I want to note that it's not enough just to focus on bread and butter issues, not enough just to push economic rights. This was kind of a path that Phil Alston, the NYU professor and the former special rapporteur for extreme poverty, was pushing. He was saying, get people to recognize their economic rights and push those and get them into the human rights cause, turn them into converts. We actually did that in the UK. We did a big report on social services. It was a good economic rights report. But did that lead the Tory base to press the government to stop sending terrorist suspects to countries where they'd be tortured? Did it encourage people to stop trying to send asylum seekers to oppressive Rwanda? Did it push people to stop plans to repeal the Human Rights Act so the European Convention on Human Rights would be unenforceable in the UK courts? No, none of the above. People would just took their social services and went home. They didn't become broader adherents to the human rights cause. And that's because, people are really willing to kind of take their right and run without additional work. Just having, economic rights handed to them doesn't turn them into Kantians where they treat others the way they want to be treated. Instead, there's a real duty to work to build a community and to recognize that, even people you don't like, even their rights are important, or yours will be in jeopardy. And that's a very difficult venture. It's one that Jack and I agree on with respect to its importance, but it's not addressed by simply doing economic rights work. Final issue I want to address is just the unpopular issues. These are the areas where Jack talks about backlash. Obviously that's true if you just sort of do the usual name calling. There's going to be backlash. But Jack suggests that the human rights movement is inattentive to audience, and that's just not how we pursue these issues. So for example, the populist appeal sort of says, we're going to appeal to the majority, and we're going to, mobilize the majority around denying some disfavored group of their rights. And if you just publicize what they're doing to that majority, they're going to applaud. They're not going to find it shameful. So instead, we have got to, focus on an audience that matters, an influential audience, which would find the conduct shameful. And so, I think that the first time I had to do this was, 25 years ago in Egypt, where we were focusing on the police's entrapment of gay men in order to torture them. And you can't just publicize it in Egypt. People would have applauded. In fact, our main Egyptian ally there said, don't even touch this. It'll make our work with Mubarak harder. But we focused on a series of groups that were being tortured, including gay men. We appealed to the US government, whose aid mattered, and the torture stopped. We got the right audience there. Similarly, when the prior Law and Justice Party, the Peace in Poland, was creating LGBT-free zones, very popular with its base, we got the European Union to pressure it to stop, and it stopped. That same government was undermining abortion rights in Poland. This turned out to be incredibly unpopular in Warsaw. There was a huge urban population that didn't share its retrograde views and was instrumental in voting them out of office. And you can say the same thing even about sort of LGBT rights in the Middle East today, where Human Rights Watch has we tended to speak through the voices of local activists to show that these are not Western impositions, that people are LGBT. That's just who they are. And why should the retrograde conservative government deny them that ability to be who they are? And this, domestic voice can be much more effective. Sometimes, populists succeed in making other forms of abuses popular. I think of Bolsonaro, where he justified burning down the Amazon by saying it was necessary for economic growth. we were able to put pressure on the European Union to say there's going to be no trade agreement with Mercosur. You're not going to get into the OECD, both things that Bolsonaro wanted, both things he wanted to enhance the economic development in Brazil until you stop burning the Amazon. Very effective pressure. Orban's efforts to stigmatize migrants, to undermine the rule of law, has been significantly curtailed by the European Union's rule of law conditionality. And so, the key always is, even if an abuse is popular because a populist has succeeded in making it so, there's always some audience that matters where it's not popular, where it's shameful. And the human rights movement focuses on that. That's the kind of pragmatism we bring to this. So just to sum up, we should be careful, not to caricature the human rights movement. It's not name calling. It's exposing and using that exposure to develop pressure to change. The human rights movement is attentive to audience. We often figure out what's the best audience for our message. We recognize that democracy is important, but it's not sufficient, and a whole lot can be done even when there is no democracy. And we've got to be wary of this fixation on movements or technical assistance, because that often abdicates the most important tools that we have. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ken, for all of those comments and for engaging so very thoroughly with the article. Professor Snyder, before we move on to the questions that we have from the attendees, I was wondering if you would like an opportunity to just respond perhaps to some of the points made.
I'll try to be really brief. Ken made a lot of excellent points, and I'll just give a few responses. First of all, on the point that everybody wants human rights, and when you ask them the question. And so there was a survey of people in many conflict zones and non-conflict countries that asked the respondents what they thought about the laws of war that limited what you could do to civilian populations. And what they found was that way over 90% of people in conflict and non-conflict settings thought that the laws of war were just really great. Except when they ask them, well, what if it's your side that feels a need to target civilians on the other side? And what if your side is losing? In fact, what if your side feels that it may be extinguished if it doesn't target civilians on the other side in ways that violate the laws of war? And in that case, they found that there were maybe 16% of people who still thought that the laws of war should apply to them in that circumstance. So, one of the problems we have in Gaza today is that both sides feel they are in that circumstance. So people will think of ways that these rules don't apply to them when it's inconvenient. On the name calling, I agree that Human Rights Watch is really good at avoiding overt name calling. Many of their reports are highly professional in documenting conduct and in recommending change addressed usually to the government of the state. When they want to engage in some kind of a high dudgeon shaming, they try very hard to put the remarks in the mouths of locals that they quote. But I found that in some randomly selected reports that I, coded by my own criteria, that quite a few of the reports wound up targeting attitudes that were accepted throughout the whole society, and and sometimes used language that made it seem like the problem was with the society itself rather than just the behavior of individuals. These are, I talk about these things specifically in the book. And I think that these sorts of charges, especially when added onto by pressure, helps elites in these societies mobilize support against, the imperialist liberals that are criticizing our culture. So in Kenya, a couple of guys who were indicted by the International Criminal Court decided to team up. They had been foes on opposite sides of ethnic mayhem during an election, and they decided to team up as a vice president and presidential running mate team, and run for office successfully against the ICC as an imperialist organization, and their main platform position was vote for us and we'll protect you from the imperialist ICC and the liberal states that threaten our ethnic groups. So on the problem of what to do in countries like Egypt, where the regime is a tough nut to crack. The best human rights organization operating in Egypt by everyone's agreement, as far as I know, is CIOS, which is a development aid organization that uses a human rights approach. And it goes to communities and it tells them, we can provide resources for economic development in your town. And we'll make an attractive plan for you for how to do that. But if you want in, you have to guarantee that women, minorities, and so forth will be included. Take it or leave it. So it's not pressure, it's dangling a carrot. It's leaving it up to the voluntary decision of the community, and they're very successful. I'll close with building a movement. So one way to build a movement is to target very popular issues such as anti-corruption. The data that I used in the book showed that 1/3 of protests in the world over recent years have been anti-corruption protests. Almost 100% of them were started by local single issue movements that were protesting against the corruption of local elites. They were not started by Human Rights Watch or general human rights organizations who came in to support them if and only if they were cracked down upon by the local government, and then on the grounds that their rights to freedom of speech and assembly were being violated, not to support them on the corruption issue, which was their motivator. And so I submit that this is leaving money on the table to not participate in the vanguard of anti-corruption and show not just through some reports, but also through organization, how it is that corruption is related to a basic human rights issues. I think that it is true that Human Rights Watch in particular went through a period a little while ago where corruption was more featured. But in looking at the recent reports, I found, nowadays, very little on corruption. And probably that's because Ken left and the people there have not picked up that ball. Okay, thank you so much. Those were great comments, Ken. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll move on to, we have a couple of questions from our audience, and I'd like to share them with both of you, and either one of you or both of you could feel free to respond. The first one is addressed directly to you, Professor Snyder, and it says the following. I understand the importance not to alienate different groups in advancing human rights. However, how would you compare the treatment of Uyghurs to Han citizens of China? The former are put in re-education camps, tortured, forcibly sterilized, and have no equal rights compared to the Han majority. How is this comparison even fair when many Uyghurs, as well as Tibetans, do not even consider themselves Chinese? And related to that, the same person says, you stated that no country, apart from small oil countries in Singapore, was able to progress beyond a quarter of US GDP without becoming liberal. China is an obvious outlier. Would you address that?
Yeah, that's good point. My ideal report on labor rights in China would be one that talked about everything, work conditions in China and how they violate standard international labor law. I would happily shame the World Trade Organization for paying close to zero attention to labor rights issues when it deliberates on trade issues. And I would, in terms of which conditions in China I would point to, I would point to many of the labor issues that all Chinese suffer, which has a self-interested component for conservative populist constituencies from the deindustrialized working class of the advanced democracies, because they want China to have better labor standards so that they won't be cheap exploited labor, that they'll be expensive labor like we have in the advanced democracies. So this is something that helps you with your home audience. It helps you convince the Han Chinese working class that you're interested in their welfare and that international labor law is interested in their welfare, that it's not just a take the money and run situation, but it's there because there's a basis in law and rights as a standard for articulating these claims and demands. But I would also talk about the Uyghurs, but only in the context of labor rights more generally in China.
If I could just come in there, I mean, I alluded to this in my remarks, but Jack, I just think that's not a pragmatic approach because, I mean, if we were speaking to the Chinese audience, I would agree with you, but we can't speak to the Chinese audience because of censorship. And even though Human Rights Watch does translate all of our work on China into Mandarin, and we try to distribute it through WeChat, and focusing on diaspora and the idea that most people are going to go back home, it's very difficult. And in fact, the main source of pressure on Beijing is external. And there, they mentioned, we have succeeded in presumptively blocking every export from Xinjiang because of Uyghur forced labor. That's not something we could have done because of, broader violations of labor rights. And so the more targeted approach was the more effective approach. If Western companies thought we were going to cut off all trade with China, we would have been banging our head against the wall. But because the situation of the Uyghurs, as the questioner notes, is so awful, because the forced labor is so pervasive, we were able to push through this incredibly powerful presumption against any import from Xinjiang. So that was the rationale behind the narrower focus, and we were being pragmatic.
Thank you. And go ahead, Professor Snyder.
Yeah, just quickly, there's a great new book that I think Ken knows about by Jamie Griffith Jones that points out that there are some issues, human rights issues, where the Chinese government allows Western criticism to penetrate. In fact, some issues where they even talk up Western criticism. And these include environment, certain women's issues, and potentially certain labor issues, because these are concerns that the Chinese government knows that the Chinese people have. And in Grufford Jones' analysis, they think that it's actually better to have these issues discussed, sometimes because they think that it's going to make people in China mad at the critics in the West, but sometimes because they think that it will actually lead to a containable, productive discussion on an issue that actually does need attention.
But that's not the case on labor rights, and it's not even the case on women anymore, because Xi Jinping wants women to stay home and have babies, so they're actually suppressing any discussion of feminism. So it's a moving target and moving in the wrong direction.
We have one more question. If establishing rights is a complex, long-term historical process with many actors involved, isn't it important that one set of actors, the human rights movement, play the role of reinforcing the existence and meaning of certain norms that the international community has endorsed? Meanwhile, there are other important actors, in particular government actors, who need to engage in the kinds of pragmatic trade-offs that are, of course, also necessary in real life. But if the idealists were not there articulating and reinforcing the norms, no one would be doing it, and those norms would lose their normative force. Reactions to those thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think Andy's right in the sense that it's not as if governments on their own are going to effectively promote human rights. I mean, they do it only because we push them to. And this is, for the Western governments I'm talking about here. And so even our closest allies don't do very much until we twist their arms. And so that, now as we've been discussing today, you don't do this in a naive fashion. You don't just articulate principles and hope for the best. When you go in and talk to the US government or the European Union or what have you, you've got to have a conversation where you explain to them why it's in their interest to be more decisive, more forceful in promoting human rights. So that's a pragmatic conversation we have to have. But if we don't have that conversation, it doesn't happen. And so Andy's right that there is a need for a group of organizations, Human Rights Watch and our allies, that is devoted to trying to kind of keep these principles alive and respected.
Professor Snyder, any thoughts from your end on this?
I think a division of labor between activist professional groups like Human Rights Watch, large-scale social movements, and pragmatic reform parties is a perfectly good idea. They have different strengths and different functions, but it's important that they work in ways that are complementary rather than stepping on each other's toes. My favorite example of this is Abraham Lincoln's charge that the Whigs lost the election that elected James K. Polk president of the United States because the abolitionists ran their own candidate against the Whig candidate in New York State. The abolitionist candidate got 3% of the vote and caused the Whig candidate to lose to the Democrat by 1%. And so Polk was elected, a pro-slavery Southern politician who wanted to start the war with Mexico so that he could expand slavery westward. And if it hadn't been for the abolitionists running that third party candidate, the Whigs would have won, Polk would have lost, and who knows, how history would have been different. This was the argument of Abraham Lincoln, and he reflected on that and became a pragmatic advocate for the anti-slavery cause. So, we need to think about both the principles, but also the consequences of following them in particular circumstances.
Thank you, and thank you both. We are approaching the end of our session, and I want to thank you very much on behalf of the Academy again for accepting the invitation to engage in this platform, but also a tremendous thank you for a wonderfully productive and engaging discussion. I encourage all members of our audience to read Professor Snyder's article in the spring issue of Political Science Quarterly, but also the book upon which it draws. Jack and Ken, thank you very much for your time and for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.